The wind, a mournful predator, clawed at the ripped canvas of the wagon, its voice a constant lament that echoed the hollowness in Ilara's chest. Each gust threatened to tear away the last vestiges of their meager shelter, exposing them fully to the vast, indifferent expanse of the Wyoming Territory. The sky, a bruised purple and gray, promised more snow, though the ground was already a treacherous blanket of white, swallowing the trail, swallowing hope. Beside her, nestled in a crate padded with their last clean linens, two tiny forms stirred, their mewling cries sharp as ice shards against her frayed nerves. Ezra and little Martha, barely a month into a world that had already shown its cruelest face. Their father, her Thomas, lay miles back, buried beneath a cairn of stones and frozen earth, his laughter and strength stolen by the fever that had swept through him like a prairie fire. Now, there was only the silence of his absence, a silence more deafening than any storm. The supplies were dwindling, the jerky tough and tasteless, the flour nearly gone. The cold gnawed at her, relentless, seeping through her worn dress and shawl, chilling her to the bone, but it was the cold fear for her infants that truly paralyzed her. Their vulnerability was a raw, open wound. If they did not find shelter, proper sustenance, soon, she couldn't complete the thought. It was a precipice she dared not look over. She pressed a kiss to each tiny, cold forehead, their skin like fragile parchment. The scent of them, milky and sweet, was a fragile anchor in the desolation. "Hush now, my darlings," she whispered, her voice raspy, unfamiliar even to her own ears. "Mama's here." But the words felt like lies, brittle and thin against the crushing weight of the wilderness and the terrifying solitude. Despair was a living thing, coiling in her belly, its icy tendrils reaching for her heart. Every rustle of the wind, every distant animal cry, was a harbinger of doom. This was not the dream they had chased west, this landscape of frozen death and gnawing emptiness. This was the end of it. The sun, a pale disk in the leaden sky, offered no warmth, only a stark illumination of their plight. Ilara shifted, her limbs stiff and aching, the gnawing hunger a familiar companion. She had tried, yesterday, to light a fire, but the damp wood had only smoked sullenly, mocking her efforts before the wind scattered the precious tinder. Now, huddled with the twins beneath the inadequate canvas, she felt the insidious creep of hopelessness. What was there to do but wait? Wait for a miracle, or for the inevitable? She had prayed until her throat was raw, until the words felt empty, bouncing off the implacable silence of the plains. Thomas had always known what to do. He'd been the strong one, the one with the easy smile and the capable hands, the one who saw solutions where she saw only obstacles. Without him, she was adrift, a ship without a rudder, tossed on a merciless sea. The twins stirred again, their cries more insistent now, fueled by hunger she could barely assuage. Her own milk was thin, her body depleted. She adjusted her shawl, trying to offer what little comfort she could, her movements clumsy with cold and exhaustion. The wind howled a fresh dirge, whipping snow into tiny, stinging pellets that found their way through every tear in the canvas. She closed her eyes, picturing Thomas's face, trying to draw strength from his memory, but even his image was beginning to blur, overlaid by the stark, terrifying reality of their present. The stakes were impossibly high, 3 lives hanging by the slenderest of threads, in a land that seemed determined to claim them. The air tasted of snow and despair, the only sounds the wind's desolate song and the fragile, desperate cries of her babies. She was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone. The relentless wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound, faint at first, then more distinct, the rhythmic crunch of hooves on snow, slow and deliberate. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped against her ribs. Hope, sharp and painful, warred with a primal fear. Who would be out here, in this godforsaken wilderness? Indians? Outlaws? Her hand instinctively went to the small, cold derringer Thomas had insisted she keep, though the thought of using it was another terror altogether. She peered through a tear in the canvas, her breath catching. A lone rider, dark and silhouetted against the oppressive grey, was approaching their broken-down wagon. He was large, broad-shouldered, his features obscured by the brim of a low-pulled hat and the distance. He moved with a quiet confidence that spoke of familiarity with this harsh land, a stark contrast to her own desperate uncertainty. Panic tightened its icy grip. A stranger. Here, where there was no law, no help. She pulled back, her mind racing. Should she call out? Remain silent? The derringer felt heavy and useless in her trembling hand. The twins, sensing her agitation, began to fuss louder, their cries seeming to pierce the very air, broadcasting their vulnerability. The rider stopped a short distance from the wagon, his horse snorting, its breath pluming in the frigid air. He sat motionless for a long moment, surveying the scene, the crippled wagon, the pathetic attempts at shelter. Ilara held her breath, feeling exposed, judged. This was it, then. The moment her fragile world might either find an unlikely reprieve or shatter completely. His gaze, even unseen, felt like a physical weight. She could almost taste the metallic tang of fear in her mouth, mixed with the scent of stale air and desperation trapped within their flimsy refuge. The man dismounted, his movements economical, unhurried. Each soft thud of his boots on the snow-crusted ground seemed to echo the frantic beating of Ilara's heart. He did not approach the opening of the wagon directly, but circled it slowly, his posture wary, observant. She could hear the jingle of his spurs, a small, metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the vast silence. He was dressed in dark, trail-worn clothing, a heavy coat that spoke of long exposure to the elements. A rifle was cradled in the crook of his arm. He was, she realized with a sinking feeling, utterly self-sufficient, a creature of this wilderness, whereas she was an intruder, fragile and ill-equipped. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach. What did he want? Supplies? Or worse? Stories of men lost to the frontier, their morals eroded by isolation and hardship, flickered through her mind. She clutched the twins closer, a purely instinctive, protective gesture. He paused near the broken wheel, his head tilted slightly as if listening not just to the wind, but to the very heartbeat of their desperate situation. She could see a glimpse of a weathered face now, stubbled, his eyes shadowed by his hat, but they seemed to scan everything, missing nothing. He said nothing. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Finally, his voice came, low and rough, not unkind, but devoid of discernible emotion. You all right in there? It was a simple question, yet it carried the weight of a lifeline thrown into a drowning sea, or perhaps, the subtle inquiry of a predator assessing its prey. Ilara swallowed, her throat dry. Could she trust that voice? Could she afford not to? Her own voice, when she finally found it, was barely a whisper, fragile as spun glass. We need help. His name, he offered later, sparingly, was Silas. He didn't elaborate, and Ilara didn't ask. His presence was an undeniable fact, a solid, somewhat intimidating reality in the swirling chaos of her fear and grief. He moved with a purpose that was both reassuring and unsettling. After her whispered plea, he'd simply nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to the bundled forms of the twins, then away, as if their fragility was a thing he preferred not to dwell on. He set about his tasks with a quiet efficiency that brooked no argument. First, he assessed the broken axle of the wagon with a practiced eye, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. Can't fix this here. Not without tools you ain't got. His words were blunt, practical, stripping away any lingering, foolish hope Ilara might have harbored of easily continuing her journey. He then turned his attention to shelter. With a few curt instructions, more gestures than words, he had Ilara gather what dry tinder she could find within the wagon while he used a small axe from his saddle pack to cut branches from a stunted pine nearby. He worked methodically, wasting no movement, the rhythmic thud of the axe a counterpoint to the wind's mournful cry. Ilara watched him, her initial terror slowly giving way to a wary observation. He was not overtly threatening, yet there was an aura of hardness about him, a sense that he was accustomed to solitude and hardship, perhaps even to violence. She found herself wondering about the life that had etched those lines around his eyes and mouth, the life that had made him so self-contained, so formidable. He seemed a part of the harsh landscape itself, weathered and enduring. When he had gathered enough wood, he cleared a space, built a small, efficient fire pit, and soon, a pathetic, smoky fire was battling the cold, more successful than her own attempts had been. He offered no false comfort, no easy promises. His help was practical, immediate, yet distant. He handed her a piece of dried meat from his own supplies, his expression unreadable. "Eat. You'll need it." The small fire Silas had coaxed into life was a fragile beacon against the encroaching dusk. It crackled softly, spitting occasional sparks into the frigid air, a small pocket of warmth in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Elara huddled near it, the twins nestled in their crate beside her, finally quiet, lulled by the faint heat and the full, albeit small, meal Silas had provided from his saddlebags, hardtack and a piece of jerky tougher than shoe leather, but to her, it had tasted like a feast. Silas sat on the other side of the fire, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic rasp a strangely soothing sound in the immense silence. He hadn't spoken much since establishing the camp, his attention seemingly on his task, yet Elara felt his awareness of her, of the babies, like a tangible presence. She stole glances at him, trying to decipher the man beneath the stoic exterior. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was rugged, etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind and hard years. There was no softness there, but neither was there overt cruelty. Just a deep, ingrained weariness, and a watchfulness that never seemed to relax. Her desperation was a raw, aching thing, but it was slowly being overlaid by a reluctant gratitude. He had not harmed them. He had offered sustenance, shelter, however rudimentary. He could have ridden on, left them to their fate, and no one would have ever known. Why hadn't he? Was it pity? Or some unspoken code of the wilderness that demanded aid to the truly helpless? She didn't know, and she was too afraid, too exhausted, to ask. The fear still lingered, a cold serpent crawled in her belly, but it was no longer the paralyzing terror of before. It was now a cautious vigilance, a recognition of her utter dependence on this stranger. She had to trust him, because there was no other choice. The alternative was unthinkable. The wind picked up again, moaning through the skeletal branches of the nearby trees, and Elara shivered, drawing her thin shawl tighter. Silas looked up, his gaze meeting hers for a fleeting second before returning to his knife. "Storm's not done," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a warning, merely a statement of fact. But in it, Elara heard the unspoken promise of another cold, dangerous night, and the silent acknowledgement that, for now, their fates were intertwined. The night deepened, bringing with it a profound, bone-chilling cold that the small fire could only partially ward off. Silas had rigged a crude lean-to against the sheltered side of the wagon using a spare canvas and some strategically placed branches, offering a little more protection from the relentless wind. Inside this cramped space, Elara lay with Ezra and Martha nestled beside her, their small bodies radiating a faint warmth that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of their fragility. Sleep was elusive, a skittish creature that shied away from the turmoil in her mind. Every snap of a twig, every sigh of the wind, sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through her. Silas lay on the other side of the fire, just outside the lean-to, a dark, still shape wrapped in a heavy blanket. She could see the faint outline of his form, the rifle propped nearby. He seemed to sleep as he did everything else, with a quiet, alert stillness, as if one part of him remained ever watchful. She thought of Thomas, of the warmth and security of his presence, and a fresh wave of grief washed over her, sharp and debilitating. How had their dreams of a new life, a small farm nestled in a green valley, come to this desolate end? She was a widow, a pauper, responsible for 2 infant lives in a land that seemed actively hostile to their existence. The weight of it was crushing. Occasionally, one of the twins would whimper, a small, fretful sound in the darkness, and Elara would soothe them with a whispered word, a gentle touch. Each time, she was acutely aware of Silas, wondering if their cries disturbed him, if he regretted his decision to stop. But he made no sign, no complaint. He simply existed, a steadfast, silent guardian against the vast, dark unknown. A strange sort of acceptance began to settle over her. This was her reality now, stark and terrifying, but not, perhaps, entirely without hope. This silent, grim man had appeared when she was at her lowest ebb. He was an enigma, his motives unclear, but his actions, so far, had been those of a protector. She clung to that small, fragile certainty as she might cling to a piece of driftwood in a raging sea. As dawn approached, a pale, reluctant light began to seep into the sky, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of grey and ghostly white. The wind had died down somewhat, but the air was still bitingly cold. Ilara had drifted into a fitful, uneasy sleep, punctuated by the twins' intermittent cries and her own anxieties. She woke with a start, disoriented for a moment, the rough canvas of the lean-to scratching her cheek. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and Silas was already up, his silhouette stark against the brightening eastern horizon. He was tending to his horse, speaking to it in low, murmuring tones that were surprisingly gentle, a contrast to his usual gruff taciturnity with her. She watched him for a moment, unseen. There was a loneliness about him in that unguarded moment, a sense of a man long accustomed to his own company. When he turned and saw her stirring, his expression reverted to its usual impassive mask. "Morning," he said, his voice still raspy from sleep or disuse. He didn't offer pleasantries, just facts. "Need to find better shelter. And hunt. Your supplies won't last another day." Ilara nodded, shame heating her cheeks at this reminder of her inadequacy. She had nothing to offer, nothing to contribute beyond the burden of her presence and that of her children. I don't know this land," she managed, her voice small. "I don't know where to go." Silas looked at her then, a long, considering gaze that made her feel transparent, her desperation laid bare. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, pity, perhaps, or just a weary resignation. "There's an old trapper's cabin," he said finally, his gaze shifting towards a distant, snow-dusted ridge. "Not much, but it's solid. If it's still standing. And if no one else has claimed it." That if hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the uncertainties that governed their existence. But it was a direction, a possibility, more than she'd had yesterday. He turned back to his horse. "Get the babes ready. We'll leave as soon as there's enough light to see the trail." The unspoken implication was clear, he was taking them with him. For now, at least, they were not abandoned. A fragile tendril of relief unfurled within Ilara, so potent it almost brought tears to her eyes. The journey to the trapper's cabin was an ordeal. Silas, after assessing Ilara's depleted strength, had insisted she ride his horse, a sturdy, stoic animal named Buck that seemed as unimpressed by the harsh conditions as its owner. He had fashioned a makeshift sling for one twin, nestled securely against Ilara's chest, while she held the other, carefully wrapped, in her arms. Silas himself walked, leading Buck, his long strides eating up the miles, his rifle ever ready. The landscape was a monotonous canvas of white and grey, broken only by the skeletal silhouettes of dormant trees and the occasional outcrop of dark rock. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of Silas's boots in the snow, Buck's rhythmic breathing, and the occasional soft coo or whimper from the twins. Ilara, perched precariously on the saddle, felt every jolt, every unevenness of the terrain. Her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep, but she focused on protecting her children, shielding them from the wind, ensuring their blankets remained secure. Silas rarely spoke, his attention fixed on the trail ahead, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He moved with an innate knowledge of the land, navigating through drifts and around obstacles with an unerring sense of direction. Ilara found herself watching him, the way he moved, the set of his jaw, the subtle shifts in his posture that indicated he'd seen or heard something she hadn't. There was a raw competence about him that was both intimidating and deeply reassuring. He was a man shaped by the wilderness, a survivor. And for now, he was their only hope of survival. She thought of the judgment she might face in a settlement, a lone woman with 2 babies and a strange man. What would people say? What would they assume? But out here, societal rules seemed distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was the next breath, the next hour, the small hope of shelter. The cold was a constant enemy, seeping into her bones, making her fingers and toes numb despite her layers. The twins, thankfully, slept for much of the journey, their small bodies a precious, fragile weight against her. Late in the afternoon, as the light began to fade and the temperature plummeted further, Silas stopped. He pointed towards a dark smudge against the snow at the base of a pine-choked hill. "Cabin's there," he said, his voice raw with cold. "If we're lucky, the chimney's still good." Ilara strained her eyes. It was barely discernible, a small, dark shape that could have been a rock or a shadow. But it represented hope, a chance for solid walls and perhaps a real fire. The last stretch was the hardest. Elara was numb with cold and exhaustion, her arms aching from holding Martha. Ezra, in the sling, began to fuss, his cries thin and weak. Silas took Martha from her without a word, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he cradled the bundled infant. He shifted his rifle to his other shoulder and strode ahead, breaking a path through a deeper drift of snow. Elara, dismounting stiffly from Buck, stumbled after him, her legs protesting with every step. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was small and dilapidated, but the log walls looked mostly intact, and a crude stone chimney, though crumbling, still stood. The door hung crookedly on one leather hinge. Silas pushed it open with a grunt, peering into the gloomy interior. A musky smell of disuse, cold earth, and something else, old smoke, perhaps animal droppings, wafted out. "It'll do," he muttered, more to himself than to Elara. He propped Martha carefully against a sheltered part of the exterior wall and began to clear a path to the door, kicking aside snow and debris. Elara, shivering violently, could only watch, her energy completely spent. He worked quickly, efficiently, his movements betraying none of the fatigue that must have been plaguing him. He was a force of nature in his own right, battling the encroaching wilderness with a grim determination. Inside, the cabin was dark and frigid, a single room with a packed earth floor and a small, rough-hewn window opening covered with a rotted piece of hide. In one corner was a crude stone fireplace, filled with old ashes. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was for walls and a roof, however leaky it might prove to be. It was a haven, bought by the grit of a stranger. The first days in the cabin settled into a fragile, unspoken routine. Silas was a whirlwind of quiet activity. He repaired the worst of the gaps in the log walls with mud and dried grasses, mended the door hinge with a strip of leather from his saddle bag, and painstakingly cleared the chimney, his face emerging smudged with soot but with a grim satisfaction. Soon, a fire was crackling in the hearth, small at first, then growing stronger, pushing back the oppressive cold and casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. It was the most beautiful sight Elara had seen in weeks. While Silas worked on the shelter and hunted, returning with a rabbit one day, a grouse the next, lean fare but life-sustaining, Elara tended to the twins and the domestic sphere of their tiny refuge. She cleaned the filthy floor as best she could with a bundle of twigs, aired out the musty blankets, and tried to create a semblance of order in the chaos. Her strength was slowly returning, fueled by the meager but regular food and the relative security of the cabin. The gnawing fear that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a weary determination. She watched Silas, always. He was a man of few words, his communication often consisting of a nod, a grunt, or a pointed gesture. Yet, in his actions, she saw a consistent, if gruff, kindness. He always ensured she and the twins had the warmest spot by the fire. He shared his limited supplies without comment. He even, one evening, spent a long time carving a small, smooth piece of wood into a vaguely bird-like shape, which he silently placed near the twins' makeshift cradle, a deepened wooden crate he'd salvaged and repaired. Elara had found it there in the morning, her throat tightening with an unexpected wave of emotion. It was such a small thing, yet it spoke volumes. She started to leave a tin cup of hot, weak tea, brewed from hoarded leaves she'd found in Thomas's pack, for him when he returned from his forays, a silent offering of gratitude. He would drink it without comment, but she noticed he always drained the cup. Trust was not a conscious decision, but a slow, almost imperceptible accretion, like dust settling in the quiet corners of the cabin. It grew in the shared silences, in the mutual reliance, in the unspoken understanding that their survival depended on each other. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking snares, Elara was startled by the sound of voices and the jingle of harnesses. Peering through a crack in the repaired window shutter, she saw three rough-looking men on horseback, their faces hard, their eyes narrowed as they surveyed the thin trail of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Panic seized her. These were not like Silas. There was a predatory air about them, a careless cruelty in their laughter. Her first instinct was to hide, to make herself and the babies invisible. She quickly doused the small cooking fire, plunging the cabin into semi-darkness, and grabbed the old derringer, her heart pounding. The twins, sensing her fear, began to whimper. "Hush, my darlings, please hush," she whispered, frantically trying to soothe them. The men were dismounting, their voices louder now, coarse and confident. "Looks like someone's home, boys," one of them called out, followed by a brutish laugh. Elara backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was trapped. Silas was gone. She was alone with her babies, facing a threat far more terrifying than the indifferent cruelty of the wilderness. These men represented the deliberate malice of humanity, a danger she was ill-equipped to handle. One of them hammered on the door. "Anyone in there?" "We're just looking for a little hospitality. Maybe some company for the night." His tone was laced with a leering insinuation that made her blood run cold. She pressed herself against the far wall, shielding the twins with her body, the derringer cold and heavy in her trembling hand. She prayed for Silas to return, a desperate, fervent prayer. But the wilderness was vast, and he could be miles away. The silence from within the cabin seemed only to embolden the men outside. "Ain't no need to be shy, little lady," another voice called. The door rattled as someone kicked it. It wouldn't hold for long. Just as the rickety door groaned under a heavier blow, a voice, cold and sharp as a winter wind, cut through the air. "That's far enough. Silas." He stood at the edge of the small clearing, his rifle leveled, his expression unreadable but utterly menacing. The three men froze, their hands instinctively moving towards their own weapons. "Well now, what have we here?" the first man sneered, though his bravado seemed diminished. "Didn't see you there, friend. Just checking on this here cabin." Silas didn't move, didn't blink. "It's occupied. By me. And mine. Move along." The possessive pronoun, mine, hung in the air, a shield thrown around Elara and the children. It was a lie, of course, but a powerful one in this lawless place. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Silas was one man, they were three, but there was something in his stance, in the deadly stillness of him, that gave them pause. He looked like a man who knew how to use the rifle he held, and who wouldn't hesitate. "No need for trouble, mister," another of the men said, his voice more conciliatory. "We were just passing her through. Looking for a place to camp." "Camp elsewhere," Silas said, his voice flat, final. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension was a palpable thing, thick and dangerous. Elara, inside the cabin, held her breath, her knuckles white on the derringer. Then, slowly, the first man raised his hands in a gesture of reluctant surrender. All right. No offense meant." They backed away slowly, gathered their horses, and with a few muttered curses and backward glances, rode off, disappearing back into the trees. Silas remained motionless until they were long out of sight, his rifle still ready. Only then did he lower it, his shoulders slumping almost imperceptibly. He turned towards the cabin. Elara fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking, and pulled the door open. He looked at her, his face grim. "You all right?" he asked, his gaze searching hers. She could only nod, tears streaming down her face, a mixture of terror and profound relief. He had come back. He had protected them. He had called them his. That night, the atmosphere in the small cabin was different. The shared terror and the subsequent relief had forged a new, deeper connection between them, though still largely unspoken. Silas was even quieter than usual, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, perhaps replaying the confrontation, or perhaps contemplating the ever-present dangers of their existence. Elara, for her part, felt a profound gratitude that was difficult to express in words. He had not hesitated, had put himself directly in harm's way for them. She mended a tear in his worn coat by the firelight, her stitches small and neat, a silent act of care. He watched her hands for a while, then looked into the flames, a muscle working in his jaw. Little Martha had developed a fretful cough, her breathing shallow, and Elara's anxiety had returned, threefold. She rocked the baby gently, humming a tuneless lullaby, her brow furrowed with worry. Silas noticed. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice low. My sister's first, he was like that. Coughed all winter. Ilara looked up, surprised by the personal revelation, however brief. What did she do? Pine needle tea, he said, after a pause. And kept him warm. Clothes. He looked at Martha, then at Ilara, his gaze surprisingly soft for a fleeting moment. She's small. Needs to be kept warm. The next morning, he went out and returned not only with a scrawny rabbit but also with a handful of fresh pine needles. He showed her how to bruise them, how to steep them in hot water. The cabin filled with the sharp, clean scent. Ilara administered the warm liquid to Martha in tiny, careful spoonfuls. Whether it was the tea, or the constant warmth of being held, or simply the passing of a minor ailment, Martha's cough began to ease over the next few days. Ilara's relief was immense. During those days of tending to the sick child, Silas was a constant, steady presence. He took over more of the heavy chores, ensuring the fire never died down, that there was always water melted from snow. He even held Ezra for a spell one afternoon when Ilara was near collapse from exhaustion and worry, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle with the small, sleeping infant. Ilara saw then not just a protector, but a man capable of a deep, if hidden, tenderness. Her own resilience was growing, nurtured by his quiet support. She was no longer just a grieving widow, she was a mother, fierce and determined, fighting for her children's lives alongside this quiet, capable stranger who was, slowly, becoming something more. The deep winter settled upon them, a relentless siege of snow and biting wind. The world outside the small cabin became a white, howling desolation. Days were short, nights interminably long. Their existence narrowed to the confines of the four log walls, the flickering firelight, the cries and gurgles of the twins, and the shared, sparse words between Ilara and Silas. One particularly brutal blizzard raged for 3 days, trapping them completely. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the door and shutters, and snow piled high against the walls, threatening to engulf them. Inside, the fire was their lifeline, its warmth a fragile defense against the elemental fury. Silas kept it fed, venturing out only briefly, battling the storm, to fetch more wood from the dwindling pile he had painstakingly gathered. During those long, snowbound hours, a different kind of intimacy grew. There were no distractions, no escape from each other's presence. Ilara would tell him small stories of her life before, of Thomas, of their dreams, her voice soft in the dim light. He listened, mostly in silence, but his attention was unwavering. Occasionally, he would offer a brief comment, a fragment from his own guarded past, a mention of a cattle drive gone wrong, a brother lost to the war, a youth spent learning the hard lessons of the trail. These were mere glimpses, but they painted a picture of a life lived on the harsh edges of civilization, a life that had taught him self-reliance at a steep cost. One evening, as the storm held its peak fury, the last of their meager flour ran out. Despair threatened to creep back in. Silas looked at Ilara's downcast face. "Don't you fret now," he said, his voice unusually gentle. He rummaged in his saddle pack and produced a small, nearly forgotten pouch. Inside were a handful of dried berries and some parched corn. "Not much," he admitted, "but it's something." Together, by the faint light, they ground the corn using 2 stones, and Ilara mixed it with melted snow and the last of the rendered rabbit fat to make small, gritty cakes, cooked on a hot stone by the fire. They were tasteless, almost inedible, but they were food. As they ate in silence, the storm raging outside, Ilara felt a profound shift within her. She was no longer just enduring, she was actively participating in their survival, her resourcefulness kindled by necessity and Silas's unwavering example. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a stranger, but a partner in this desperate fight. The fear was still there, a shadow in the corners of the cabin, but it was overshadowed by a growing strength, a quiet dignity. She had faced the worst, and she was still here. Her babies were alive. And she was not alone. The blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a world transformed, pristine and silent under a blinding white blanket. The sun, when it emerged, sparkled on the snow with a diamond-like brilliance that was almost painful to behold. But the beauty was deceptive, the cold was more intense than ever, and their food supplies were critically low. The rabbit snares Silas had set were empty, buried under deep drifts. Game was scarce, driven to shelter by the storm. The hollow ache of hunger became a constant companion for Ilara, more terrifying now because it threatened her ability to nourish the twins. Silas grew grimmer, his face taut with worry, though he tried to hide it from her. He spent longer hours hunting, returning empty-handed and exhausted, the lines around his eyes deepening. One morning, Ilara awoke to find him gone before dawn. Panic flared briefly, but she pushed it down. He would not abandon them. Not now. She tended to the twins, her movement slow, conserving energy. Ezra was listless, his cries weak. Martha, though better, was still fragile. The day stretched, long and anxious. The silence of the cabin, usually a comfort, felt oppressive. As dusk began to settle, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, she heard it, the distant, unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. Hope, sharp and fierce, surged through her. Then, an agonizing wait. Finally, she saw him, a dark figure struggling through the deep snow, dragging something behind him. A deer. Small, and lean from winter, but a deer nonetheless. Relief washed over Ilara so powerfully her knees nearly buckled. He was covered in snow, his face frost-nipped, his breathing ragged, but his eyes, when he met hers, held a weary triumph. He collapsed by the fire, utterly spent, while Ilara, her own hunger momentarily forgotten, rushed to help him with his burden. Knew there had to be one, pushed down from the high country by the storm, he panted, his voice hoarse. That night, the cabin was filled with the rich, savory smell of roasting venison. It was more than just food, it was a victory, a testament to Silas's resilience and his unwavering commitment to their survival. As they ate, sharing the precious meat, a profound, unspoken gratitude flowed between them. In that moment, facing the stark reality of their existence, they were truly partners, bound together by hardship and the shared will to live. Ilara looked at her children, sleeping peacefully, their bellies full for the first time in days. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, a strength forged in the crucible of loss and fear, and tempered by the quiet courage of the man who sat across the fire from her. Spring arrived slowly, tentatively, like a shy visitor. The iron grip of winter began to loosen. Patches of bare earth appeared, dark and damp, and the relentless wind softened, carrying the scent of thawing soil and the distant promise of green. The days grew longer, and the sun held a gentle warmth that felt like a benediction. With the changing season came a change in their circumstances, and in Ilara. The immediate threat of starvation receded as game became more plentiful, and Silas taught her to identify edible roots and early greens. The twins, too, thrived in the milder weather, growing chubbier, more alert. Ezra's listless cries turned into gurgles of contentment, and Martha's laughter, when Ilara tickled her, was like the brightest birdsong. Ilara herself felt a resurgence of life. The gauntness left her face, replaced by a healthy color. Her movements were no longer solely driven by desperation but by a quiet purpose. She planted a tiny garden near the cabin with seed Silas had unexpectedly produced from the depths of his pack, a few beans, some squash, tending it with a fierce hope. One afternoon, as she sat outside the cabin mending one of the twins' small garments, Silas approached her. He had been unusually pensive for days. He stood before her, hat in hand, a rare gesture of formality that made her heart still. Ilara, he began, using her given name for perhaps the first time with such directness, the passes will be clearing soon. There's a settlement, Callister Creek, about a week's ride east. They'll have a preacher, a store. Folks. He paused, his gaze fixed on some distant point. It's time you were thinking about getting her there. For the babes. For yourself. The word struck her with unexpected force. A settlement. People. A return to the world she had almost forgotten. It was what she should want, what she needed for her children's future. But the thought of leaving this small, isolated cabin, of leaving Silas, brought a sudden, sharp ache. He had been her rock, her protector, her silent companion through the darkest days of her life. He was inextricably woven into the fabric of her survival, of her transformation. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "And you, Silas? What will you do?" His gaze met hers then, and she saw a flicker of the deep loneliness he usually kept so well hidden. "I reckon I'll move on," he said, his voice low. "West, maybe. Still country out there a man can get lost in." The unspoken words hung between them. He did not belong in settlements. He was a man of the wilderness. Ilara's heart constricted. The thought of parting, of facing the world without his steady presence, was a new kind of desolation. But she also knew he was right. For Ezra and Martha, for a future beyond mere survival, she had to go. She nodded slowly, a lump in her throat. "Yes," she whispered. "For the children." The day of departure arrived under a clear, azure sky, the air fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. Silas had repaired the old wagon as best he could, reinforcing the wheels, patching the canvas. Buck, laden with their meager possessions, and the carefully bundled twins in a makeshift cradle secured in the wagon bed, stood patiently. Ilara, dressed in her cleanest, mended dress, felt a confusing mix of trepidation and a fragile hope. She looked around the small clearing, at the cabin that had been their refuge, their world. It seemed so small now, yet it held the weight of a lifetime of experiences. Silas stood by the wagon, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a depth of emotion she had rarely seen. He handed her the reins. "Trail to Callister Creek is mostly downhill from the ridge. Keep the sun to your back in the mornings." His instructions were practical, as always, but his voice was rougher than usual. Ilara's hand trembled as she took the reins. "Silas," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the immensity of her gratitude, the complex bond that had formed between them. Words seemed inadequate, trivial. He reached out, his calloused hand briefly covering hers on the reins. His touch was warm, firm. "You'll do all right, Ilara," he said, his voice low. "You're stronger than you think." He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw respect, and something akin to affection, carefully guarded. "Take care of those little ones." He stepped back then, putting a physical distance between them. Ilara swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "Thank you, Silas. For everything." It was all she could manage. He merely nodded, his gaze lingering on the twins for a moment before shifting to the distant mountains. "Go on now," he said softly. "Don't look back." With a heavy heart, Ilara urged Buck forward. The wagon wheels creaked, a mournful sound as they pulled away from the cabin, away from the man who had saved them. She did not look back, though every instinct screamed at her to do so. She focused on the path ahead, on the future she had to build for her children, a future made possible by the quiet courage and unexpected kindness of a lone cowboy she had found in the wilderness, or perhaps, who had found her when she was most lost. The wilderness had taken so much, but it had also given her an unlikely guardian, and in the crucible of shared hardship, it had shown her the depth of her own resilience. The journey ahead would be long, uncertain, but she faced it not with despair, but with a quiet strength, her heart filled with a bittersweet mix of sorrow and a nascent, determined hope.